Hi, I'm Terrell Turner, the host of the Law Firms and Finance Show. And today we have a great guest on because one of the big challenges that a lot of firms have is knowing how are they doing compared to the industry, compared to their peers. It's very difficult to know if you're going in the right direction if you only live in your bubble of data. So I'm pretty excited to have someone from the Clio team that I've heard speak at a conference, and he really dives into the legal trends reports and brings out a lot of different things that every law firm should keep in mind when it comes down to running a law firm, whether you're a solo, a mid-size, or a large firm. So stay tuned for today's episode. So without further ado, let me bring on my guest. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me, Turner. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I've been looking forward to this conversation because, I've for the past probably 2 years read the legal trends report that Clio produces, and I'm like, man, there's a lot of information in here. So before we dive too deep into talking about that and some of the benchmarks and the amazing data in there, can you tell us a little bit about kind of your background and how you came to be part of the Clio team?
Absolutely. For your listeners, my name is Joshua Lennon, and my title at Clio is Lawyer in Residence. And that's a made up title because I am a New York licensed attorney living and working in Vancouver, Canada. And as many lawyers know, a legal license does not travel well. But I met my significant other, who is Canadian, and followed her up to Canada, to the Great White North. And in doing so, I began running my own immigration law firm, building it from scratch, and coincidentally using this new to the market piece of software that I found online called Clio. And there were two reasons that I picked that. One, New York at the time had a bona fide office rule, and you had to have an office in New York to practice in New York, which is where I'm licensed. And second, I was spending every weekend commuting back and forth between Western New York and Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So I'm literally driving around the Great Lake. And I needed to take my law firm with me. So I was looking for a piece of software that was portable, either could run on my laptop or could run via the cloud, which was this newfangled thing at the time. And there were two options to choose from, one of which was Clio, a Canadian company, and I was spending some time in Canada, so I leaned into it. And I started realizing how little I knew about running a law firm. All of these things that I took for granted working at the Missouri Attorney General, like having access to a research library, not having to worry about billable hours, the fact that there was a document management system and case management system already like kind of designed for the office. It wasn't great, but it existed, and I didn't have to make choices around it. And now I had to make choices about every little thing. What was going to be my hourly billable rate? How was I going to get invoices to people? How were they supposed to pay me? These were all questions that I found myself just lost trying to find answers to. And in part, I was having conversations around those answers and how to like implement them through this piece of software I was using, Clio. And those conversations led to me meeting with the founder, Jack Newton, having lots of conversations around how Clio is helping me versus areas where I think you could improve, and also feedback that I was receiving from other lawyers about Clio. And those conversations really led to the point where it seemed like I could be contributing to improving Clio, and by doing so, improving other lawyers' ability to practice law, which is something that's really important to me. The practice of law is hard, but it doesn't have to be as hard as it is. So in 2012, I closed down my immigration law firm, packed up my bag to move from Toronto, Canada to Vancouver, Canada, where I am now, and began being the lawyer in residence at Clio. And in that role, I find myself oftentimes translating the needs of lawyers to a technology company, but I equally find myself doing the opposite and transforming the impact of technology and translating it back to lawyers and law firms so that they can really seize the advantage of what legal technology can do for the practice of law. And I've been doing that for almost 11 years now.
Wow, that sounds like quite the journey. I mean, I'm very curious. Like I said, when you started using Clio,
Mhm.
uh, uh, there was probably, I guess, did you find many other lawyers that were using Clio at the time, or was a lot of learning the features, kind of doing your own homework on it?
It was a bit of both. So you could find lawyers using it, but they were mostly solos. They were tech savvy in terms of using the internet as their water cooler. And so your ABA, GP Solo, Mail Listserv, for example, which is a really old technology that still exists today, was a place where people would go and chat on like bulletin board equivalents, and there would be email threads, and that's where you would find these geek lawyers who were using tools like Clio. And it was mostly solo and small firms, just like I was, really trying to figure out like how can we just do better at this thing that really hasn't changed for most lawyers in 20, 30 years.
Wow. So I mean, when you think about that, I mean, going from a digital kind of, message board where,
Mhm.
which probably aren't, compared to today's standards, aren't the easiest to search for answers or present questions as easy as it is now, to where you think about this massive research and like library of resources that Clio provides. So what was it
Mhm.
like kind of seeing that journey develop, of like the amount of resources available, like that has just grown since then? What has that been like?
Yeah, so there have been two things that Clio's been really fortunate to leverage on behalf of the legal industry. The first of which is we've just become the most widely used cloud based practice management solution out there. So we have more lawyers and more law firms using us than any other similar piece of software out there. And that's exciting because we're able to, in an aggregated, anonymized fashion, take lessons that these lawyers are teaching Clio, like how they're using our software, where they find it being really useful versus where do we need to improve it. And we can actually turn that back around into better ways to practice law. And so that's actually part of the legal trends report that we'll be talking about in a second. And the second thing we've been really fortunate to have is the backing of some really powerful venture capital firms who have invested heavily in Clio and enabled us to have this room to grow and develop that we would not have if we were just trying to do this all in a shoestring budget. And so it's really given us like a leapfrog 5 to 10 years in development because we can hire the developers, we can hire our in-office support agents, we can have a lawyer in residence who can all be thinking at the same time, how can we make the practice of law easier? And so between those two things, a phenomenal set of users and collaboration around the use of legal technology, and space to invest and investigate because of our venture capital, has made it just a powerful place to produce insight that I'm really happy to share with you today.
Nice. I love it. So
Mhm.
I want to talk a little bit more about the legal trends report. So,
Mhm.
how long ago did Clio start producing a legal trends report?
We've always been a data driven organization. And we started thinking about the Legal Trends Report actually in 2014 when I wrote a change into our terms of service that allowed for law firms to participate in anonymized aggregate reporting. And I keep using that phrase, anonymized aggregate, because it's very important. Clio does not have the ability to see case files. We have both technical constraints that are built in to prevent that from happening and contractual obligations not to. And between those two, we can't see case files. But what we can see is how lawyers are using the Clio software. And even that limited view is more insight than anybody's ever had into the practice of law. So an example I like to give is that you can set an hourly billable rate in Clio. And that actually shows up in our usage data as a bell curve. We're going to see somebody at the low end, say $20 an hour, and somebody at the high end, say $2,000 an hour. And Clio has to be able to calculate bills and invoices on either side of that pole, right? But I can't tell you which lawyer is charging which. I can't tell you what clients they're charging it to. I just know that somebody has set an hourly rate at that amount. But I can also see a bell curve in between those two poles of $20 and $2,000. And I can tell you what the most common hourly billable rate is in the United States. If we pivot it against some other publicly available information or other usage data, I can actually break that down by state. What's the average hourly billable rate for particular states? I can do it for certain giant metropolitan areas because we're fortunate enough to have enough lawyers contributing data there. And I can even tell you by certain practice areas, and we track about 40 in our legal trends report. What are the average billable rates per different practice area per state in the United States? So that's an example of how that anonymous aggregate data, that high level view of just how lawyers are using Clio, still gives us more insight into the practice of law than ever before. If we jump back to me trying to open my own law firm, if I wanted to figure out what I should charge as an hourly rate, my best bet was to ask a couple lawyers who hopefully knew what they were charging in a smart way, right? And older lawyers didn't have my student loans, right? They didn't know, right? The cost that I had to have as a startup lawyer with just coming out of law school with 6 figures in debt. And so if they weren't right, then my law firm was on the back foot from day one. And now, just from that example, right, we can take a look at what is the average billable rate for a family law lawyer in Florida and see, like, okay, if I have X number of cases with this rate, will that make a sustainable law firm for me, or do I need to adjust based on my own personal circumstances? So it's amazing that we start having data insights. So that was 2014 when we're like, okay, we know we've got a unique data set. And we need to really figure out how to structure a permissive way for law firms to collaborate and work with us on this. So there's a setting that also came out in Clio that law firms can opt out of this aggregate reporting. So 2014. Then we started wrestling with that data for 2 years. We had to learn what questions to ask and what was the data telling us. And that led to our first legal trends report in 2016. And that one was like a bomb going off. I cannot understate the impact of that reporting that we put out. And we really only looked at a couple of key things. What was the average hourly rate, which again had never really been published before. And the second thing we published was what we call our lawyer funnel. And we were able to look at billing data and determine 3 key performance indicators, or KPIs. And these are benchmarks now in the legal industry. And the first of which is utilization. How many hours in, say, like an average 8-hour workday are being spent on billable activity? Mm-hmm. How much of that billable activity is then being recorded on an invoice that's being shared with the client? That's realization rate. And then how much of that invoice are clients actually paying, which is a collection rate. And none of these metrics are rocket science for small business, right? But in terms of having benchmarks to compare them against, they'd never existed before. LexisNexis and Westlaw would publish surveys from like AmLaw 200 law firms that would show lawyers working and billing 7 hours a day. And then we looked at our data, and what we found is most lawyers were lucky if they were billing 2 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And through the cuts from that utilization rate down to the realization rate, down to the collection rate, they were lucky in 2016 if they were getting paid for 1.5 hours a day. It was such a shock when we saw that data and compared it to what like other publications were telling us, that we knew, one, we were on the right track, in discovering things on behalf of our customers. But two, we have a lot of work to do to figure out why this is the case, and what we can do to help improve those metrics in the future. And honestly, every successive legal trends report since has had that as its core focus. How do we take a look at these key performance indicators and figure out ways to improve law firms' productivity, their collections rates, their sustainability when it comes to revenue?
Hmm. You know what? I think that's a really good point because one of the things that I find when working with different law firms, a lot of times they're a little skeptical of relying on KPIs and data. Because like I said, when if you saw that, hey, the metrics that were being posted is law firms were collecting on 7 out of 7 hours, but your law firm is struggling with cash flow, you're like, something isn't adding up. So, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that that adds so much value there. Now, another thing that I've noticed with the legal trends report is there was a breakout. I guess this the first year of breaking out mid-size and solos into a separate report?
Yes, we have taken a look at solos in the past, but this year we also have launched the Legal Trends Report for mid-sized law firms. It actually just came out a couple weeks ago, and I just presented it right before talking to you as a Clio webinar. So it's really top of mind for me. And um, early on, we noticed that size matters in law firms, and their benchmarks differ. But again, it takes a long time to kind of figure out this data. Oftentimes, data raises more questions than answers, and we think we're starting to hone in on the different things that really make solo law firms tick versus mid-sized law firms and everybody in between.
Mhm. I think that's a really good thing because I think I've seen quite a few firms that, solo has its own unique challenges. And then when they
Mhm.
want to expand past solo, it's like, hey, there are a new set of challenges and factors to consider in that. So, I mean, I think it's great that you guys are breaking that out. And I guess for clarity for the audience, when we say a mid-sized firm, is that what more than 21 employees or?
We said 20 lawyers on up. So
Okay, got it.
we tend to focus on lawyer headcount when it comes to the legal terms report, based on unique ownership structure of law firms.
Okay, gotcha. Now, in thinking about that context, so I had the privilege of reading the mid market report, and a couple of things that I found to be very interesting. It talked about the adoption rate of technology in mid-sized firms versus solos. Was that a surprising fact for you guys when you saw that?
It actually was simply because of how low the mid-market adoption rate for certain technologies were compared to that of solos. Simple things that I think like you and I take for granted now, like video conferencing, is still used by just a small percentage of mid-market law firms.
Wow.
And oddly enough, they're much more likely to have clients from diverse locations. They're actually reporting a higher percentage of their clients being from out of state. So I have to ask, like, how are they talking to clients if they don't have a Zoom account of all things? Whereas you flip to solos, and the vast majority of solos are really adopting technology and leveraging it on behalf of their practice, and it's showing up in their benchmark stats in really interesting ways.
Wow. That would be an interesting thing for all the firms that are listening. If you're a mid-sized firm and in leadership is be a good thing to look at is, if you're not using Zoom and you have out-of-state clients, is probably should take a look at how much you're spending on travel and comparing that because yeah, when I saw that, I was like, man, such a low adoption rate compared to smaller ones. Now I know
Yeah.
some firms started to adopt, well, kind of were strongly urged as a result of navigating COVID. Have we
Mhm.
seen kind of that adoption rate kind of slow back down now that we're a couple years out?
It's kind of a yes and no, because there's a second thing that we mentioned in the both the solo and the mid-market report is we take a look at lawyers and their desire to change jobs. And so What we saw in solos is if you're a solo, you really kind of want to stay a solo. It becomes you're in state as a lawyer. But what we see in mid-sized law firms is they had the highest reported instances of employees either leaving in the last 12 months or planning to leave in the next 6 months. So the industry average in our survey was 29% when you combine both those groups. It was closer to 55% when you looked at mid-sized law firms. And so they're losing kind of their best and brightest. And anecdotally, I can tell you they're leaving, they're coming to Clio and utilizing Clio and Zoom and all those technologies. So it's these firms not adopting technology that is leading to more firms using technology. But it's kind of like a migration rather than a growth for the mid-sized law firms themselves.
Gotcha, gotcha. I'm curious of just how and I'm not expecting you to have the answer to this, but how the mid-sized firms are navigating that. I mean, if there's a high interest in attrition, it's, how do you keep continuity of service when so much knowledge may not be in a technologist in a person's head? It's like rebuilding every time a person leaves.
Yeah, it's almost incalculable the loss, right? Because not only do you lose that timekeeper, right, who wants to go and work in a new modern environment, but you also lose all the knowledge that goes with them. So you've got to lose your own time in hiring, lose your own time in training, and then hopefully at the end of that, you have a timekeeper who can produce. And so the fact that you're losing these people so rapidly is really surprising to me. And in the mid-size presentation that I did today, I'm really defining it as a flip of the old standard for law firm advancement. It used to be that it was you would either go up or out. You'd either make partner or you would leave the law firm. And what these lawyers are telling us is that they're going out because then they can lift themselves up into a new partner role, either in their own law firm or as a lateral. And so you really need to be mindful of your employees, and this sounds bad when I say it, not needing you, and instead going out and doing it on their own. You might need them more than they need you. And that should flip your management style and your expectation around.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, that is definitely a new thing that a lot of industries, really have to wrap their minds around it. So I'm curious, and I don't want you to share any details that you guys are still working on, but as far as since we have broken out the mid-sized firms and there is a solo report, will that change kind of the focus of the larger trends report that comes out at, the CleoCon in October, or will that just be an encompassing of every size of a firm?
We're still going to be talking about every size of a firm there, but I do think um, and this is a sneak preview for your listeners, it is kind of coloring some of our interpretation. Uh, we are now looking at the data as we do analysis for our 2023 legal trends report and asking questions like, how does this differ for a mid-sized law firm versus a solo, rather than just taking it on face value. And we're also really mindful of this data is now starting to become representative, not just of Clio users, but of the legal industry as a whole. We continue to be really fortunate and with tons of law firms choosing to use us and contribute and collaborate alongside us. And so we're becoming a greater and greater percentage of not just a software user, but an industry. So are we reporting things in such a way that it is directly applicable to the greater legal industry, whether you're a Clio user or not? And that is something we continue to work with. One example of that is we have our benchmark rate calculator tool, where you can swing by clio.com /LTR and actually compare your rates to the rates of lawyers in your state or the rates of your timekeeping staff against timekeeping staff in your state and really see where you stack up. Because we know that while this feedback and kind of this virtuous cycle we have with our customers and this contributed data, we also have a greater obligation to the legal industry as a whole to share it. And those are different ways that we're doing that.
Awesome. So when it comes down to the legal trends report, where can they look online again to get that?
Oh, it's Clio.com. That's CLIO.com /LTR, which is our own shorthand for Legal Trends Report. Hopefully, I actually didn't say LTR too much in this podcast. I find myself slipping into that every now and
Well, awesome, awesome. Well, I
then.
love it. Well, two very quick things before we go. First one
Mhm.
is CleoCon. How excited are you? And for those that don't know about CleoCon, can you tell them when and where it will be this year?
Absolutely. So ClioCon is another shorthand for the Clio Cloud Conference, which is our own conference that we host every year. And it's actually been moving around for the last couple of years, but this year it's going to be in early October in Nashville, Tennessee. We're expecting something like 3,000 lawyers from across North America and around the world to come and learn together on the best ways to manage law firms as a business, the best types of technologies that work within law firms. And we have our own track on how to better leverage Clio on top of those two other tracks. We've got phenomenal keynote speakers. We're going to be unveiling the 2023 version of the Legal Trends Report, and we're going to be setting up law firms for 2024. So we hope everybody can join us. If you can't join us in person, we actually did just release some virtual attendance tickets where you can see all the keynotes, learn about the Legal Trends Report, and a lot of other great sessions without having to leave the comfort of your office or couch. So if people are interested in either coming and joining us in person or online, they can swing by ClioCloudConference.com, where tickets are still available. We're actually starting to run low on in-person though.
Gotcha. Awesome,
Mm-hmm.
awesome. Well, the final question is, there's so much value in the legal trends reports. And, when you're talking to, different law firms, like even the session you had today, if you had to think about two really big takeaways that you would share with, a audience of law firm owners, what would those two big takeaways be?
The first, which is focus on those KPIs, those key performance indicators that I talked about. A small improvement in utilization can actually lead to a gigantic increase in revenue. As part of our 2022 report, we saw that just a 2% increase in average utilization, so from 31% to 33%, can lead to something like $36,000 in extra revenue per lawyer. And so based on like average hourly rates and the average amount of time logged in Clio. So that's a small change that can make a big difference. And the way you improve that is by automating and delegating. If it's not a billable activity, find a tool or a person to do it for you and get back to work being a lawyer. That's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is dependent upon the firm size. So within solo law firms, our report found that they really aren't setting enough hard boundaries for themselves. And so they're losing themselves working all hours of the day, all days of the week, and communicating with clients who do have a need to communicate outside of business hours and on the weekends, but they're not leveraging the tools to do a lot of that for them, like say a client portal where clients can upload their own documents, send you secure messages, book their own appointments during the work week. The flip side to that is actually for mid-sized law firms. And what we see is they've been resting their laurels on having a high utilization rate because they have delegated a lot of work in the past. So if the average law firm has a 33% utilization rate, mid-sized law firms are right around 45% utilization rate. Nearly half their day is billable, which is good, but it's not changing and might actually even be retreating at this point in time based on some of our measurements. So they can't just rest on their laurels. They need to look at these KPIs and find ways to constantly be improving the small little things that make a big difference. So
Awesome.
I snuck in 3 takeaways rather than 2.
No, I love it. I'm sure the audience will not mind at all. So, Joshua, thank you so much for coming on and being an amazing guest.
Thank you. I actually really enjoy the content that you're putting out. Lawyers aren't trained as business people, and so we need all the help we can get. Thank you.
Awesome.